Starting your first job out of college is not easy. The workplace is a very different place than the classroom. So in this video, I'm going to share with you guys 7 things that I wish I knew when I started my first job out of college. So if you're new to the channel, then welcome. And if you're returning, then welcome back. I'm Jackie. I make videos about learning Chinese, about career and mindful living. But before I dive into that, I just want to give a little bit of background first about why I'm even making this video. So I grew up as a first-generation college graduate, and what that means is that my parents didn't get the opportunity to go to college. So my sister and I are the first ones in our family to go to college. That also means that there weren't a lot of people who could show us, how to navigate college, how to navigate the workplace after college. These are some of the things that I learned through experience and through mentors of mine that I'm hoping that you can benefit from and hopefully avoid some of the mistakes that I made. I currently work as a data analyst at a tech company, and I used to be a former consultant. But before I dive into the things that I wish I knew, I want to share a piece of advice that someone did share with me early on in my career that I found really, really helpful. If you don't know what you want, then iterate quickly and reflect often. So a lot of us, probably most of us, don't really have a clear idea of what we want to do long term. When we think about what we want to do in 5 years or 10 years time, that's a really big question to answer. And so the thing I really like about iterating quickly and reflecting often is that it gives you permission to try out a lot of different things. You don't have to have all the answers right now. You don't have to have it all figured out. It's really about picking a direction that you think is correct, a direction that you might want to explore that might help you get answers to 2, I think, really important questions. The first is, what do you like to do? And I know that sounds like a really simple question, but it's actually really difficult when you think about something that you like to do that also can give you the lifestyle that you want. Because pragmatically speaking, there's also not just the type of work that you want to do, but the type of lifestyle that you want, and whether or not that work or that career can fit into the type of lifestyle that you want holistically. The second question is the opposite of that, which is, what do you not like? And I think you get a sense of that from trying out a lot of different things and just really thinking about it. Like, maybe you can't tell in that moment because you're really busy, and in the day-to-day you're not really reflecting on that question a lot. But when you look back to work that you've done, whether it's in school or whether it's in a job right now, you do have an intuition whether or not it's something you enjoyed doing and whether it's something that you want to continue doing. So by experimenting and trying to figure out answers to those 2 questions, I think you get a lot of insight about yourself that can help you as you progress along in your career. So for me, I took this to mean taking a job in economic consulting as my first job out of college. So at the time, I was interested in economics and I was interested in business, but I wasn't really sure which direction I wanted to pursue. I was thinking about becoming potentially an economics professor one day, so going into the route of academia, getting a PhD in economics. And the other route was really the complete opposite of that. It's going into industry, working in business, and not necessarily going back to school. So I really liked economic consulting in that sense because it was kind of the best of both worlds. You're working in consulting with businesses and real clients, but at the same time, the people that you're working with are all economic experts. It was a good way to figure out answers to those 2 questions of what do I like and what do I not like? And that's kind of how I ended up in my current position right now, where after 2 years of economic consulting, I decided that maybe academia wasn't for me. And so now I'm fully within so-called business side. So just really quickly here, because I think a lot of people know about consulting, but when they think about it, they think about management consulting, the type where you're working on strategic projects and you're probably flying out often from Monday to Thursday and interviewing clients, and it's very client-facing overall. Economic consulting is a little different in a couple of different ways. The first is that you're not generally traveling because you're not necessarily a client-facing role. Your boss and the experts at the top might be the ones who are talking to the clients. But at a junior level, what you're really working on is a lot of economic analyses from both the quantitative side and the qualitative side. So the quantitative side is like working with a bunch of different types of data, cleaning it, writing scripts to understand it and analyze it. And then on the qualitative side, you might be doing things like literature reviews to make sure that whatever argument that your team is making is grounded in solid economic theory. So just wanted to touch on that really quickly so there's no confusion about what economic consulting is, because I do know that it's a pretty niche industry within consulting and not a lot of people have heard about it before. So tip number 1 is doing your job is not the only part of your job. You know how in school you get handed an assignment or you have a quiz and all you have to do is answer all the questions on there and you get a good grade, right? But at work, it's not quite the same. When you get handed an assignment, when your manager tells you to do something, it's not always clear if what they're telling you verbally is exactly what they're looking for. In other words, you have to learn how to read in between the lines. Now, one example that I think of in my first job is doing a literature review. So for those of you who have never done a literature review, it's basically going through past papers, past articles for whatever topic you're interested in to see what other people have said about this topic. If you get that assignment, you might think, okay, I'm just going to read a bunch of academic papers, I'm going to read a bunch of articles, and I'm going to summarize all that information, I'm going to pass it along to my boss. But the second layer of that, which they might not be asking but might be looking for, is, how does that literature review, how does all that information you found affect our case? Does it change the way we have to frame our argument? Does it go completely against our argument? Does the way that we're approaching it make sense? Or is it something that no one has done before and that we're going to have to build up this entire theory to support? So it's all those questions in the background that might not necessarily be said, but that you might also have to think about, or that's expected of you. And that's definitely something that I didn't understand maybe the first couple months of my job, where my manager would tell me to do something and I'd do it, but then they'd be always asking about the so what, like, okay, what's the next step? And looking for me to be proactive about thinking about those things. That is very different in school, where you hand in your assignment for the week, you're done. You hand in your exam, you get the score, you don't have to think about it again. The second thing is really simple, but sometimes also really hard to do in practice, and that's to ask a lot of questions. So you might have heard the phrase before, there's no such thing as a stupid question. And in general, I'd say I agree with that about 90%. But the 90% comes from, it's usually better to risk, embarrassment or feeling silly than it is to completely misunderstand something and end up, let's say, wasting your time or end up doing the wrong thing completely. Now, the 10% comes from, there's this balance, right, of what makes a good question. And I think a good question is one where you've done a little bit of your own homework first, and you can show that you've made an attempt at least, but, it's just not going the way that you wanted to. A potentially bad question is one that you could have, if you had done a little bit more research or just spent a little bit of time Googling, gotten an answer to. So something like, how many zip codes are there in the state of California? That's probably something that you could have Googled. Not sure why you would need that information. That's something that you might not need to ask your manager about. Especially for your first job, you kind of have a pass, or not even just your first job, but when you're first starting out at any job, you kind of have a pass or this rookie card. People don't actually expect you to know all that much, so they expect you to ask a lot of questions. The third thing is a little bit more difficult to do than asking questions, at least in my opinion. Don't just say yes to things, be willing to challenge things. So I know that can be really difficult to do, especially you're coming right out of college or you're really young, and your managers, your bosses are much more experienced, they're much older than you. But I found that when I was working as an economic consultant, oftentimes that I or someone else at my level would be the only ones who would be really, really diving deep into something. Oftentimes that means we were the only ones analyzing a particular data set, and so we would be the only ones, kind of eyes on the ground with visibility into issues that we were seeing. And so, a classic example is, let's say your manager asks you to do a piece of analysis and they're saying, can we answer this question with the data that we have? And you might be able to answer it, but maybe it's, not a really compelling answer. Maybe there are issues with the data that you can't solve that lead you to not have an answer at all. Those are things that are really important to communicate. Admittedly, it's not always the easiest thing to do to challenge someone, and it can feel awkward. Sometimes it feels pretty uncomfortable. And so, I'm really appreciative that a couple of mentors taught me ways that you can do that don't come across as directly confrontational, because one, that's just not fun to work with, and two, it's not as effective if your ultimate goal is to make sure you're having a thoughtful discussion. And so some of those key frameworks or phrases that I've found really useful: I noticed XYZ thing, I'm wondering if, and then you propose, a potentially different idea or a way of looking at something. Another really simple way to do that is asking a question rather than phrasing it as a statement. So rather than saying, I think you're wrong about this, you ask, have we considered this alternative? And then you propose reasons or explain your rationale for why you would use that alternative instead. That sounds really easy to do on paper, but it's something that will take time, it's something that will take practice, but it's something that's really important throughout your career and a good habit to pick up on in your first job. The fourth thing is, and this one might seem obvious, spend time nurturing relationships. The reason I say that is because in college, it's really easy to get into this mindset of, your head's down, your headphones in, and you're just studying away, and you're able to get good grades that way. You don't necessarily need to study with groups. And depending on your job and what you do, that might still be true. You might work in a job where there's not a lot of collaboration. But I think across many functions, and especially across the first job that I started, collaboration is really important. And I don't mean that in the sense of just, working in a group project. Like, we've all had those in college before, and you have to collaborate to get things done. But I mean building long-lasting relationships with people that exist outside of the work that you're doing. One obvious reason is you're going to spend a lot of time with your coworkers. You want to be able to enjoy those relationships. Obviously, that doesn't apply to everyone. Like, some people might not get along as well with their coworkers. Some people might just want to keep it professional and not as, on the personal side. But something that I found really valuable is when you're asking for advice, when you're trying to figure things out that you might not know, it's really nice to be able to ask people who maybe you don't directly work with, but because you have a relationship with them, it's easier to go to them. You feel more comfortable about reaching out for advice and things of that nature. Number 5 is about being proactive about feedback. And I think that's a place where school is a lot different than work. Because in school, you get grades on things, right? You turn in an assignment, you turn in an exam, you get a number that tells you how well you did. In work, it's not that clear. In most cases, you don't get a number. You don't get, this clear thing that tells you whether or not you've done a good job or a bad job. A lot of times that feedback is pretty qualitative, right? It's through casual conversations, it's through discussions and check-ins that you get that feedback. So a lot of companies have, annual performance reviews and sometimes even quarterly reviews or check-ins. But if those things don't exist, then you have to be pretty proactive about reaching out to the people you work with in order to understand how you're doing, how you can do better. One really nice framework that I like that I've learned from Gork Ing and a lot of other mentors is very simple. And it boils down to basically 3 questions. 1 is trying to figure out what you're doing well, right? So what should I keep doing? 2 is about things that maybe you're not doing as well. So what should I stop doing? And then 3 is about opportunities to do things that maybe you're not even thinking about. What should I start doing? And so even with just these 3 questions, it really can start a conversation with your manager, with your coworkers about ways that you can improve. That's something that's very different. Like I didn't have to do that in college, right? You don't go to your professors and ask them at the end of the semester, like, hey, how did I do? Because you know how you did. You might not even need to talk to your professor to understand that. Number 6 is keep an open mind. So if you're anything like me and you don't have a clear sense of what you want to do long term, but maybe you have a general idea of things that you might like and things you might not like, I challenge you to potentially let go of those assumptions. In consulting, there are probably high profile cases that everybody wants to work on. Those are like the really cool cases that are on the news. They're like the tech cases, the companies that people know. But I found that when I look back on my 2 years in consulting, some of the biggest learnings that I've had were in industries and cases that no one's probably ever heard of before. Like working in metals and commodities and mining, like things that, I don't ever talk about with people on a regular basis and seem really niche. But when I think about how much those things challenge me and what I learned from those projects, it's actually really valuable. And I feel that keeping an open mind is really helpful for that. Because I think in the beginning, I definitely had this mindset of like, if it's not a super cool case, then I don't want to work on it. And then finally, tip number 7, and something I wish someone told me is, don't be so hard on yourself. If you're watching this video, you're probably already on the right track. You're trying to find ways that you can improve yourself, and you're probably someone who holds yourself to a really high standard. So while it's great that you're always, trying to learn, you're always trying to improve yourself, that you don't push yourself too hard. Because learning and progress, it takes time. Like what I mentioned earlier of the new hire card at any job, like you're not going to be able to learn everything and figure everything out within the first couple weeks or even first couple months. I think it's really important to allow yourself to have that grace where you're making mistakes, where you're learning a lot, and okay with things that are out of your control. For me, something that was really difficult the first 2 months I started my job was, it was a lot slower than I thought it would be. I joined still in the middle of the pandemic in the fall of 2020. And the first 2 months of my job were really slow. So instead of casework, I was oftentimes on websites like DataCamp or Coursera trying to teach myself skills like programming. So while that was fun and I did learn some skills from that, I also found it a little frustrating. And I was worried that I'm not working as hard as I should be. But looking back on that, it's like, oh, actually, that was perfectly okay. I was worried that other people would judge me, that I wasn't working enough, but that turned out to be completely fine. So everyone goes through those periods where sometimes it feels slow, and then there are definitely those other periods too where it can feel overwhelming and you feel like you have too much to do. Whether you find yourself on one or the other, I think it's just really important to be kind to yourself and to acknowledge that whatever difficulty that you're going through is going to teach you something. Even in that moment, if it's really difficult, it's really frustrating, in the long term, there's going to be some value in it and some meaning in it that you can find. Hopefully you found this video helpful. If you're looking on YouTube for these kinds of videos anyway, you're probably on the right track. And I'd love to hear down in the comments below like what tips you found helpful, and also outside of these things, what other pieces of advice that you've learned from your own experiences as well. So peace.